All right, welcome to I think this is episode 13 of the Train Smart podcast. I'm Nick Young, the lead instructor and host of the show, and we have a training group called Velox Training Group with Max Gates, and Max is my AI. We basically travel around the country teaching performance shooting. So today, super duper excited. We've got your friend and mine, Paul Costa from Achilles Heel Tactical. Thanks for coming on, dude.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. I think we're going to have a good talk today. Got some good, interesting stuff.
I think so, too. So kind of a backstory. Paul is one of those guys that I talk to several times a week about training. And pretty much every time I talk to him, I'm like, man, we should have just Skyped and pushed record because this would have been a super good podcast. So finally getting around to having him on, and I think this is going to be a legit banger. Paul, tell us who you are for the two people that are listening that don't know you, and like what you do and all that jazz.
I guess in a nutshell, we'll keep it streamlined. It's always weird to talk about yourself, but I'm active LE, have 18 years experience and counting. Last 10 years has been as a special operations canine handler on a full-time team. Subcontract to a bunch of different agencies and departments for canine services. I've been teaching firearms for about 15 years, whether that's in the department or privately. I am a USPSA Masterclass Carry Optics guy currently. Recently brought on to the Walter staff as a pro staff instructor. Work for Achilles Heel, obviously, and I have my own training company, Broken Arrow Defense. And then I'm co-owner of Arrow Training Concepts, which is a training facility in Ohio, Newark, Ohio.
Do you have any fucking free time, or do you just monetize all of your free time?
Yeah, married, 2 kids. There's not much. I don't really have. I've surrounded my life with my hobbies, basically. You know, like I enjoy all these things, so that just becomes my life.
I hear you. If you do it well, you might as well get paid for it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think a really good topic for this podcast would be some rifle stuff. So up front, Paul and I talk a lot about training, and I may or may not offer unsolicited advice and give some soft bullying at times.
Yeah, I was gonna say, all right, unsolicited advice means bullying out of the blue. It happens to everybody.
Well, maybe. So Paul
I don't do it bullying because I don't take it as bullying. It's feedback that he thinks I should look at, and then I kind of decide whether I'm interested in listening to Nick at the time or not, and it goes whether I think it's valid or not at that time.
That's actually like one of the things I like about you, right? It's like, well, I know what you're saying, but I disagree, and that's totally fine. And it's like, I feel like some people sometimes like they take feedback way too hard, where it's like they take it personally. And one thing I like about you is like you don't ever do that. So I want to hear about, you've been exploring stuff with the rifle. You've been changing rifle setups, muzzle devices, optic heights. I want to get into all of that, but I want to start with the mount. So things that you've been working on with the mounts, things that you're finding to be advantageous, because I gave you unsolicited advice. However, you're actually going, like, I talked to you yesterday and you were like, yeah, I just shot 1,000 rounds of rifle, just exploring the mount. So like Paul is going out training on his own, trying to figure this stuff out, which I really dig. So what is some of the stuff that you're trying to figure out with the mount, and what's some things that you have found to be advantageous?
So I guess we should take one step back, right? Because originally when we trained together, I was mounting a gun a lot different than you were, right? And you were like, hey, I think you should check this out. And I was like, nah, man, like I'm good. Like this is working for me. Like maybe that's good, not good.
What specifically was working at the time?
So everything that I was doing at the specific distances, I was able to get fast and accurate hits, right? And then when I wouldn't get the hits, it wasn't like oh my God, what happened? I have no clue what happened. It's like just shooting in general. It's like, yeah, man, pushed on the gun, violated some core principles. Like, so I could easily equate cause and effect to why I wasn't getting the result I wanted. And the solution was always like, well, it's not the mount, just do it right. You know, that's it's always what it is. Like, hey man, like this mount works when I do it.
Yep.
What I found was over a painful, arduous journey is when I really started like pushing it way far back, like some 100-yard doubles and stuff like that. Like that got nasty. There was some ugly stuff going on there.
How far back were you going before?
I pretty much went back to like 50 was the farthest.
Okay. But you had, well, we could talk about rifle setup a little bit later, but yeah.
Kind of like the discovery process, right?
Yep.
So I'd go back to 100, some things were off. And, you know, the problem with shooting is, man, you can do enough stuff correct just to like confuse the shit out of yourself.
Yep.
That's such a good point. Yep.
So I say this in my class all the time. I'm like, that's the problem when you don't pay attention to core principles and really look at stuff deeply. Like you will hook up and you will do stuff right. And that will just kind of prolong your journey of really figuring out maybe the right solution for what you're trying to do, because there's remnants of success there. And obviously shooting a rifle, like, you know, 25 yards and in, you can get away with borderline anything. And I'm talking like speed factor, like as fast as I can pull the trigger, 12 splits, blazing fast mounts, you know, call them like 0.3 first round, depending on like the distance, you know, like I will collect alphas. And predominantly like that was good enough for me. Now, keep in mind, I am running like a well-tuned rifle, right? And this is kind of where like the journey started to veer off, because I wasn't necessarily contributing a lot of that success to, you know, Joe making me a really nice gun that was gassed well, you know, muzzle brake on it, which I'm not off muzzle brake, so we're not going there. But like,
we're going there.
Yeah, we're going there, but I'm not fully leaving her yet. You know, she's good. But you know, there's definitely some contributing factors in the way your gun's set up that will allow you to do things. And I don't want to say it's incorrect, because it's not incorrect, but it allowed that specific setup to work.
Yeah.
When you go to other platforms, you don't have the same level of success.
Now, so I fully agree with you. So every time I've said something like this, there's typically a comment or two or three or four of people that are like, well, if you want to set your rifle up for hard mode, why don't you set your pistol up for hard mode and do something like shoot 10 mil? And I feel like I get where they're coming from, but I feel like that's also a lack of understanding. So like for me, and you can agree or disagree, whatever. So like for me, a pistol, despite how, you know, tuned a pistol could be, unless you're shooting like, you know, like a raced out open gun, right? A pistol is going to move, right? It like you don't have the amounts of points of contact on a pistol. You can mess up a lot on a pistol, right? Even like, dude, my Walther steel frame with the long stroke guide rod and spring and minor power factor ammo. Is it soft? Yup. Does it still move around when the thing goes bang? 1000% it does. However, a rifle you can set up to where when you pull the trigger, gun goes bang and basically doesn't move. You can turn recoil off on a rifle. And now, like if you're, like in my opinion, hey man, if you're doing stuff like 3-gun, by all means, like set the gun up for the game that you're going to play. But that's not really what we're talking about here. So
well, again, I would, without getting too deep into pistols, like the goal of pistol shooting is not to eliminate recoil anyway. So adding more recoil isn't changing what you're trying to do in pistol shooting anyway. It's a 10 millimeter, as long if you're making the 10 mil recoil consistent, you're doing the same thing as you're doing with a 9. That argument doesn't make sense there.
I've done the same exact like demo in classes.
Right. Someone
had I don't know all the numbers of Glocks, but it was like the full size 40 cal Glock. Was that like a 22 or something like that?
Yes.
had iron sights, and he was like, "Hey man, can you do it with this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And like shot doubles with it at 10 and stacked them up in like the size of a baseball. It's like, yeah, it hits my hand a little bit harder, but I'm doing the core principles, and this is why like that looks successful. I do, however, think though you can set a rifle up to where it doesn't do anything.
Yeah,
you can totally. And listen, like that's the beauty of it, right? That's why
Sure.
people love rifle. It's fun, right? You can get a result that you want just by having a pretty good setup gun. Now, I will say there's just because you set it up where it's a very flat shooting gun, people still fuck that up. You know, you still push on the gun. You're still not picking small spots. You still got to stay connected to the target. You still have to do a lot correctly, especially in your like intermediate distance, like 50 and 100 yards,
Sure.
if you're putting aggression on it. You know, so even the world's best gun is not going to get you the result you want at speed without those core principles being there.
I agree 1,000%. Yep. But for training purposes, right? What do you find to be advantageous of a rifle? Like in terms of rifle setup, like what do you do for the muzzle device? What do you do for the optic? All that jazz.
So inherently, I think like you meant like competition rifle setups and things like that, right? Like I shoot competition, but I don't view myself as a competitor, right? I got into competition to make myself better for my real world job in law enforcement. I saw a lot of value and I saw a lot of crossover, right? So kind of the thing, like when I look at stuff that I'm setting, I always kind of want it to be geared towards what I would do, what's applicable for real life applications with the tools that I use. Now, I know that the muzzle brake is kind of taboo, but I would also add the caveat that the suppressor, although highly tactical, has the exact same result as a muzzle brake, with making that gun react in a very cleaner, more predictable manner. You have the extra weight on the gun. If it's a free flow can, that's straight muzzle. That's recoil deleted as well, right? So keeping that all in these little factors, that's kind of where I was originally. Now, as I started to expand more, I started to mess around with different devices, such as like 3 prongs, 4 prongs, stuff like that. And what I was noticing was at those farther distances, like 25 yards, I can make it work. You know, does the gun move more? Substantially, yes, it 100% does than my other two. But I could still get it if I had good visual connection. The gun would return right back. At the farther distances, since the gun is moving so much more, it becomes easier for you to violate the core principles, right? Like the dot becomes more distracting when it's lifting out of the A zone, and you're like, oh shit, man, this thing's going. Yep. I better help her, which we know never gives you the result you want, right? So what I found with those other devices, it's not necessarily the device itself, but it stimulated me to violate the principles more, right? So that was interesting. One of the bigger things that I found about it, because when we get into like specific mounts and stuff, I was able to do it all kind of at the same level when I really focused. The difference that I really found was when it went bad, that looked like. And that was more interesting to me than the successful results. So when I started really looking like a more firm cheek weld, lower mounts, things like that, a little bit different hand placement. Although I'm human, I make plenty of mistakes. The mistakes weren't as bad. They were like Charlie's, not Delta Mike. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at like a realistic application. You're like, okay, although I'm questing for, surgical accuracy, if things do go bad, I'm okay with the Charlie, Delta Mike, not okay. So that's kind of really what pushed me heavily into exploring and starting to set up the guns a little bit different and changing all the mounts, is because when it went bad, it wasn't that bad. And that's what I paid attention to, not what was successful, because honestly, like I said, I was able to make it all successful if I just didn't violate the principles. But that doesn't mean it was consistent as another mount, or the right way to do it. Does that make sense?
For sure. I think for me, like the way that I set up the rifles that I train with a bunch, right? The way that I set them up is because, like you said, like mistakes are way more. It's like what's that?
Apparent. They're way more
Yeah.
magnified. Yeah.
Yes, it's way more magnified. Like a shorter, let's take for like an 11.5-inch gun, for example, with a 3 or 4 prong muzzle device, right? Like the mistakes are magnified. And so for me, I think one of the hardest things when I started shooting that type of setup was the visual piece specifically, because I was so used to, shooting with a muzzle brake, the gun didn't move around a whole lot. And so now I have an 11.5-inch gun that every time it goes bang, it like lifts almost like a pistol, especially at 40, 50, 60 yards, right? And so the visual piece I found to be way more difficult, just because, if you're not used to seeing the gun do, that one thing that it's doing, it's like it makes it very difficult to look past that and like be target focused. And it also makes it very difficult to not want to, as a result of not being target focused, trying to help the gun come back down and trying to steer the thing around. And so I want, my mount and the visual piece to be subconscious. I want it to be unflappable, right? Meaning like if I see the gun lift off of the alpha, it's like, it doesn't bother me, right? Like I'm still target focused. I know, my mount, like I trust the mount to facilitate the gun returning in the way that I want it to, things like that. I want it to be unflappable. And I want that to be, a subconscious thing.
Well, I also think kind of what changed me as well is I didn't want my skill level to be tied to a specific setup and type of gun, right? And that's
Dude,
tough.
you're gonna hurt some feelings.
Yeah, it hurt my. I wasn't happy about it fucking either. But, these things do matter, right?
Yep.
And I think if you understand the core principles and you pay attention to the core principles, it was just like when I stopped shooting comped pistols, right? That like I used to shoot comped Glocks, dual ported comped Glocks, right? And it was the same kind of premise as with shooting the brakes on the rifles. I went to a Glock 34. There was a little bit of a learning curve, but nonetheless, if I stayed target focused and didn't pressure change, right, kept good structure, like I got the result I wanted. Just the picture looked a little bit different. And as long as I could like inoculate myself to like what that looked like, it wouldn't stress you out. You'd be less likely to change. And that's kind of what I'm seeing with the rifle too, except with the pistol, my grip was correct. So it was more visual, like discipline with the pistol. With the rifle, the mount needed to drastically change for those other setups.
Yeah.
Well, the visual piece is always consistent, right? I mean, you have to have that right to do whatever. But kind of like with pistols, you can shoot a rifle with a brake the same way you shoot a rifle with a muzzle or with a flash hider. You cannot shoot a muzzle or a rifle with a flash hider the same way you shoot a rifle with a brake. It does not work. It does not go both ways. Right.
And that's kind of what I found, and that's what led me to believe. Well, I shouldn't say you can't shoot it with the same level of aggression.
Sure.
Right?
Well, right.
Yeah. So you could still shoot fairly fast, but like when I do like my testings with doubles and bill drills, like I have I have that Timothy Daniel Horner trigger. It's very right. So shooting 12, 13 splits with that thing is easy. So that's what I'm doing my doubles. Like I'm not even trying to like just stay in predictive realm. I'm trying to like full send on that trigger and keep those same splits. And with that 3-prong, well, I have 4 prongs, but with the 4-prong, and especially that 11.75 with the carbine length gas system, dude, that was humbling. Like extremely nasty. I don't like it. I like it for training. Great training. It's a great way to validate and test different concepts and techniques and principles that you think you want to introduce into a class, because maybe that's not going to be my training gun, right, that I go run around teach with. But if I think that I'm onto something and I want to introduce it in a class, well, that's kind of like the litmus test. Like, does it work with this? And if it works with that, now it works with everything else.
So
I enjoy shooting it from a training perspective. I don't enjoy shooting it from an enjoyment perspective.
for sure. So, all right. So you mentioned principles a couple times. What are, like, when you try to think about, the way that you mount the rifle, what are some key principles for that people can,
Yeah.
focus on in their own training?
So what I'm looking for is a durable mount, right? So connection interface with my body that's durable, that doesn't change. So structure is solid, and that goes into posture and things like that as well. But I'm looking for a durable. I'm looking mainly for consistency, right? I need the same pressure, same connection throughout the shot string, no matter how many rounds or how aggressive that I'm shooting. And I'm looking to create the gun to react in a predictable manner, right? Same stuff I'm looking for with the pistol as I'm looking for with the rifle. We just have more points of contact. Now, what changed was I used to mount the gun more center lined, and I'm kind of in like a hybrid right now. I like the center line mount because of the speed to present the gun. The index is like very quick. It becomes very intuitive. It almost becomes like you can predictively point and shoot that gun, knowing that it's going to arrive with, enough training and experience. Like, I know that visual cue is going to be there at a certain time just based on, reps and mechanics. So it was very intuitive to shoot that way. And since it was a very gassed well gun, muzzle brake on it, I was able to keep a solid enough structure behind it where I had a cheek connection, but it wasn't the same level of connection to the stock with my cheek.
Yep.
The gun didn't move as much. So even out to distance, I was getting very good results. Right.
Now, hang on, because people are going to wonder. Sorry. Sure. What do you mean by center line? Do you mean like on your sternum, or do you mean like try to describe it for those that are driving in their car?
So everyone's body's different, right? Center line is not like in the middle of my body, right? It was just more on like my pec and less in my shoulder pocket.
Like on the center of your pec.
Yeah, like not the center of my pec. It's still more on the right because I just want to bring it up in front of my eye, right? So all I had to do was raise this gun right in front of my eye, and that made it very quick to pick up the dot and start shooting. And there was less variables, right? Okay. With the shoulder shrug, it's not that there's more variables, but there's more moving components to it, and you can over push that gun. Now, with training and experience, it doesn't become a thing, right? But that was one of the things that I found, like, that I needed to figure out that specific spot that I interface the gun when I shoulder shrug, so I could still shoot that same first round. Where when you're more center line, there's no moving parts except you just bringing the gun up, and it lands right there. Does that make sense?
For sure.
So yeah, I was doing more center line with the guns, set up with muzzle brakes and things like that. Carbine length gas systems, they're fairly easy to shoot, right? When I went to carbine length gas systems without muzzle brakes and 3-prongs, what I found is I needed a better cheek connection. You can see this has a riser on it, right? Mm-hmm. So although when I mount centerline, I can still get some cheek connection here. The cheek connection really isn't cheek connection. It's just like touching.
Yeah.
Contact is different than connection.
Yeah. Like I have contact with it, but I'm really not doing anything with that connection that's assisting me in recoil. Yep. And that's kind of one of those things where it was like, nah, man, connection to it. And it's like, do you? It's the same thing as grip, right? Like, yeah, my hands are in the right spot, but are you actually, getting those pressures correctly to actually control the gun? And what I found was like that high mount will never facilitate me to get that proper cheek connection, but it only presents itself when I'm shooting the more difficult guns. Because shooting guns like, this 14.5 mod mount with a brake, it didn't matter because the gun didn't move that much, right? So it didn't require the same positive connection that I would really need on that gun to trap my shoulder and my face to keep this buttstock locked in there to minimize the movement, right? Yep. And that's kind of the journey that we've been going with these different things of like, okay, what is real cheek connection and what is required. And honestly, it doesn't happen unless you start changing platforms, because like I said, this gun doesn't require it, you know, and I love this gun. I ain't putting it away, but
I think people get confused because your chin contact, it can be consistent. Put your face in a consistent spot every time, and they're saying, I'm not getting parallax, I'm seeing the same place every time. And I relate it to, like, have you guys ever shot a compound bow or like bow hunted much?
No.
They have what's called a kisser on the bowstring, and you put that in the same place every time, and it's just to consistently line up where your eyes are. But obviously, it's a bow. It's not doing anything for recoil. I think it's the same thing. People are equating just my chin's landing in the same spot. It's very consistent. Yeah, but it's not doing anything to help you control recoil when it could be. And I think until you explore that it actually can help with recoil, trapping the gun between your shoulder and your cheek can help with recoil, I think people overlook that as a point of actual contact.
Well, they overlook it as a way to index the gun, right? Like, this is not talked about with rifle. Like, I have never heard, and maybe I'm just not looking in the correct spots. That very well could be, but like you very, very, not even rarely. Like I said, I've never heard someone talk about indexing a rifle like you would a pistol, right? Like, building an index with a pistol is a foundational skill. Building an index with a rifle is a foundational skill. And I think, if you're missing out on one of the 4 points of contact, how consistent is that index going to be, and how durable is that index going to be?
Well, I think it's very consistent if you're shooting the right gun.
Yes.
Sure.
That's the problem.
Well, like, what you mean by that is, like, hey, if you're shooting a gun, like you just had there, muzzle brake, it doesn't do a whole lot, right? Like, you can get away with a whole lot. Therefore, things never really present themselves, right? And that is, so if you shoot that type of setup, and this is just my opinion, that type of setup inside of 25, and you are not hypercritical of what your impacts look like on the target, I think you're doing yourself a real disservice, right? Like, if you're just going sweet, all alphas, it's like, man, you are not paying attention to stuff. Like, with that type of setup inside of 25, it should be like 2 holes touching. And if it's not, you put input into the gun and made it go somewhere else.
Yes, double.
Yeah, and it's like, I started asking people in classes, or started bringing this up, like, hey, like, what type of accuracy can you squeeze out of that gun at 100? Most guns, it's a 2-minute gun, right? Like, off the rack AR, it's a 2-minute gun. At 100 yards, all right? So if we're at 15 and you have a group that is the exact same size as the alpha, what is doing that? What is making it that big? And it's like, at the end of the day, you are, right? So, like, this is the stuff that we need to be very, very critical of. And I think that when you have rifle setups with, muzzle brakes and adjustable gas blocks, all that jazz, not saying I don't have that stuff. I do. However, I have training guns, right? Like, it makes it very difficult to be that critical, because you just don't see a whole lot out of those guns.
I think you'll see it, right? But it will require you to really, really, right? Because I still see the same stuff. Even with setting up some of my other guns that have muzzle brakes on them with lower 1/3 or absolutes, I can still see the same stuff. It just doesn't, like we said before, it doesn't print as bad, right? So, like, 1 inch matters, to some specific input that I put into that gun. So it's there. Just most people haven't shot enough rounds or paid attention to enough specific things, and are really, like, diagnosing and assessing every little micro input that they're putting into the gun. They're just like, hey, cool, alphas, awesome. Or even like, all right, man, like, the group is 2 inches off, but what's in A zone's what, like 5.5 inches or 6 inches wide? What, I don't know.
6 inches or 6.5 or something like that.
Yeah. Like, 2 inches off your black paster, you're like, all right, man, fist size group. We're like, yeah, well, you're right. In reality, that's collecting max points. That's not bad, but there's a lot of information there that you're missing and you need to pay attention to. So if you're going to shoot those breaks and stuff like that, that's fine. but you just need to be hypercritical. And listen, I'm not getting rid of all my breaks. I do enjoy them. But I have to be hypercritical when I shoot them if I want to get the value out of it.
Well, and again, I think this can be said almost as a rule. People aren't shooting rifles at rifle distances.
100%.
So what are rifle distances? I actually got that question on YouTube the other day. Someone was like, "What the heck is a rifle distance?" So I think that term is said, and I agree with you. But like, what does that mean?
50 yards and out.
Yes.
So I would say 25 yards and out.
Sure, fine. Even it's sure, because you're right. My performance, I just had this last week. I was yanking on the rifle at 20, shooting doubles, and it was fine. And then I moved back to 50, and it was not fine.
No.
Yeah. So yeah, 25, somewhere in that realm. But I mean, stuff that you can get away with 20 and in, you cannot get away with at 50 yards. And my pistol performance, I think, okay, that's fair, Paul. We can draw that line. Pistol performance, I'm pretty comfortable 25 and in, shooting pretty fast. Outside of that, I start to really have to do some different things. Rifle, it takes up the rest of that space.
Yeah, and Max, you hit it on the head. It's like, hey, just because you can get away with it doesn't mean you can, right? Like that whole mindset, I think, should go away. It's like, oh, I can get away with it. It's like, yeah, dude, and then you get used to doing that inside of that distance, and then you get out of that distance, and that translates to mics or deltas, right? Like we should be analyzing our training a whole lot more than like, sweet, all alphas, like I'm doing great.
Which is a functional thing too. I mean, yeah, rifles you talk about a gunfight, which I've never been in and never will be. But yeah, they bring more power, but they're also supposed to add some standoff distance. You're supposed to be able to have some distance there that you don't have with a pistol. And if you're just doing stuff that you can get away with and pat yourself on the back with at pistol distances, then you're really not bringing anything additional to the fight other than some more power, which, is important, but it's somewhat negligible. If everything outside of 20 yards, you're still not helping anybody with.
Well, yeah, and if you're not hitting what you're aiming at, that kind of sucks too.
Here's a question for you, Max. So you said when you were shooting the 20-yard line, right? Things were going good. You were getting your hits. But were you being as scrutinizing as you should have been at 20
yards? That's right. No, 100%. Because if you'd taken that's right. And if you take, but getting away with is getting, like I was getting, like you said, I was getting my alphas. I was getting A's, and it was a fist-sized group. And we've demoed this in class, and I saw Mark with JBS demoing it too. If I would have been shooting a 20-yard target with a 50-yard target, at 50 yards and had been printing on both of them, it would have been a lot easier for me to see what I was, okay, this seems like accuracy, but it's not really accuracy. It's hard to be that critical when you're, doing it right. Because I wouldn't have missed. I wouldn't have sent one into the crowd. Yeah, it would have been all A's. But yeah, it wasn't critical enough. But all A's is, and it's not, again, I'm not shooting a 6.5-inch group. I'm shooting a fist-sized group at 20. But what I was being critical of beyond the hits was I'm watching my dot do things that I wasn't seeing at 20 yards, because you don't see that at 20 yards. Even if I am getting good hits, I'm not seeing the dot do shit at 20 yards that I'd be paying attention to, where at 50, my hits were worse, and I'm all of a sudden noticing, oh shit, my dot is coming off the paper.
Yes. So that, yes, it's doing the exact same thing. However, since you're at a further distance, it is lifting off the paper.
Right. So then I'm telling myself to you guys, I'm trying to yank on the rifle more. I'm getting in my head like, what? Why is my shooting looking like shit? Why is the dot bouncing everywhere? And then you start yanking on the rifle, and it was the complete opposite reaction to what it should be, which was I needed to pull my hand in, drop my elbow, and let go a little bit.
Yep. Yeah. So, all right. So we kind of went on a little sidebar there.
You did.
So, Paul, how have you started changing your mount? What are some things that have been helping you out?
So the first thing, so I don't think I'm a full shoulder pocket, like all the way out with the aggressive shrug in. I've kind of split the difference there, right? So I'm not center line, but I'm not fully on like the outside most portion of my pocket. I'm a little bit more in, I would say, on the outside of the pec, right?
Yeah, that's about where I put mine. Yep.
Yeah, so that still gives me the shoulder shrug. It still gives me with the correct mount, right? Like I have the 226s are gone, man. They're dead to me. And it's hard for me to say because I love them things, man. Like I really did. I got like 50 of them. Like they're all useless. They'll be on. If you guys want to buy them, DM me. Send them to. Like they just don't facilitate what my newfound kind of understanding of what I want to be able to do, right? And I don't want to have like, well, this is my mount for this gun, this is my mount for another gun. Same thing with pistol grip, right? Like I need one mount and it needs to work for everything, regardless if I'm shooting a brake gun or that 11.5 3-prong, right? Like it all needs to be consistent. I don't want to have different mounting procedures. So to back up again, I'm still a little bit more, and I'm not married to this yet, but this is currently in my progression. What I found, I'm kind of on the outside of the pectoral. That still allows me to give that good shrug up. It also gives me a little bit faster index because it's not such a extreme move over, right? So when I'm on the farther outside here, and it's a lot more movement to bring it up. When I'm a little bit more center lined here, like, but not, center lined, it still requires a shrug, but the gun's not coming over left. It's just kind of coming slightly over left and up in front of my eye.
Yeah. One thing that I think is really important for people to note here is like if you mount the gun center line, that shoulder shrug will not work. And now that might sound like common sense. However, like some people don't realize they're like, I'm lifting and it's not going up. And it's like, I know because the stock is on your pack, not on your shoulder.
Yeah. So, Paul, because people are going to ask because of your line of work and we get asked it too. Well, one, how often do you shoot in armor? How often do you shoot in a plate carrier?
Well, I mean, I do jobs every day. So not that we're in shootings, right? But I'm running around with a rifle every single day in plate carriers. Now, I will say we get whatever we want for gear. So we have swimmer cut plates. We have streamlined plate carriers. I have all of this accessible to me because we do a lot of our own purchasing. We have grants. We able to get the tools that we need to allow us to kind of pick and choose the mounts that we want. So we're not running those beast vests with shoulder pads and all that kind of stuff. Like we don't have like the armor on the sides. We have very slimline plate carriers that allow me to have that same mount.
Yeah. Well,
now,
and
that is not every department, right? So, and this is why I made a post about it not that long ago. It's options, not absolutes, right? I don't run around the country trying to make people clones of me. What I want them to understand is the principles and their rifle setup, and then apply them as they see fit to get the result they want. So, hey, man, if your armor doesn't allow you to have that, well, the core principles are going to be the same, right? You just need to interface that gun in a different spot. And that shoulder shrug is kind of a great technique because regardless of, as long as you're not perfectly center lined, even if you're kind of halfway in or depending on where you decide to put it, it will bring it to your face. So I now recommend for guys to do that. It's a more solid connection than saying put your buttstock in one click and do that. Like I run my phone on my plate carrier in the front here, right? So like I can run my dog camera on that. We have ATAC on that for operations. So I couldn't do that anyway with that specific setup because that would just like, it's too much movement on it. I'm not going to be able to really get a good connection to the gun with pushing on that case. Some guys don't run that type of equipment, right? So maybe they could put the stock in one and do that. It's doable, right? But I think also doable on a flat range and doable in a more dynamic environment are two separate things. And you need to be doing your own kind of evaluating of like, does that actually make sense? So I don't really want to tell guys you have to do it this way. I will give you what I've learned from my training experience, what I found to be successful. And I'll say, hey, man, these are the principles that we need the gun to react. And I need you to figure that out and get the gun to react like this based on your kit, your setup, your application. And maybe they're not in Mill or LE, right? And they don't run around in plate carriers. So, hey, man, like do what you want, as long as we don't violate the core principles. And we know this. Now I know as we stretch the distance farther back, they're going to learn the same points that I'm teaching them. I'm just not going to force it on them. Through exploration and training, these things will present themselves, as we all know, regardless. And then they're going to be like, man, that's not working. And it's like, cool. Here, you could try this now. Shit, man, that got a little bit better. Yes, that technique was a little better, but you still got to pick a small spot. You still got to not press on the gun, right? All those things. So I like to give guys options, not absolutes, that are encompassed with the principles, and let them kind of be the creator of their mount. You know, does that make
1,000%.
I think most of the people that are asking those questions aren't guys who are running around in kit.
Yeah.
Most of the time anyway, but
most of the time it's guys that are not actually doing that stuff in kit, right? Like, yeah, they may have it and they may, go on a walk with it or something like that. But in terms of shooting, what I find a lot of the time is like someone asks, hey, can you still mount the gun the same way in kit? And it's like, well, have you tried it?
Yeah.
Right. Because if you haven't tried it, it's kind of like, I'm not sure what we're going to talk about here. Right. Because we're not on the same level in terms of understanding if you haven't even tried it for yourself. So like I tell people, like, hey man, a lot of this shit's personal preference. Personal preference is typically dictated by your level of experience and what you've done with the thing.
I also think too, we got to keep it in, like, kind of go back to what I said before. Recreating on the flat range when you're paying attention is not the same as subconscious performance, right?
1,000%.
So, like, if it takes you an immense amount of bandwidth to set that mount up, even if I ran it center line on my plate carrier, right? Is that going to be subconscious application in real life when I need it? Most likely not, right? So we really have to look at really deep, because just because you can pull it off, like when you give me all the time in the world to be like, okay, put a click in, do what I got to do.
Stand there facing the target.
Yep. Be like, okay, don't change anything. Whack, 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 whack. Right? Like, is that the same of running around with a gun and then having to mount the gun quickly from a non-mounted position, right? Like if I'm running, I'm not running around with a gun like this, right? I'm chugging, and then I need to quickly come into a mount and get that proper mount to be able to facilitate good shooting. These are all the things that we want to look at. And I think, and we do this in the classes. I know you do it in your guys' classes too, right? Like, if you expose people to the right type of stuff, they'll lead themselves to the right answer without you having to tell them. And if they don't, right, then the results are going to show. Because really, like, it kind of has to be done a specific way if you're shooting that level of aggression.
Well, yeah, it's like the work after a class, like that's the true work. The work is not in the class. When you're in a class, the idea is to basically be shown some things like, hey, what should I be paying attention to? What are my like key behaviors that maybe I'm not aware of that I need to try to change? Like that's the stuff that the instructor should be helping you with, and then the work starts after the class.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of work too is, at least with my demographic of students, they're not even aware of principles.
That's right.
They're not even aware of like what's the litmus test of like what classifies this as good or not good, right? Like what am I looking to get this gun to do? Like that's a big portion of what I hit on, is like building awareness and understanding. Like same thing with pistol. Like guys are they're not even aware that like their grip's changing in the pressure. They're not aware that they're changing pressures in the mount, right? So I spent a lot of time on that, just getting them to understand like where these problems are actually really coming from. And then once they understand that, then we could kind of have that conversation of like, what's the right mount for you and your application? Does that make sense? Right? Because
well,
that's how we grade it.
That's where I think for guys who don't have the ability to get the experience themselves on a range or in a class, or who don't have the ability yet to diagnose what they're doing, that's where I think competition and things like that make a big difference, because that's where you see, if you go in with an ego thinking I'm doing pretty good, Nick and I both have this experience, Paul, I'm sure you have too, go in thinking I'm pretty good, and then you go there and then you see what people are doing with the gun.
I believe the correct term for that is getting clapped.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or you go to a class and see, an instructor who is doing good demos and can show you what the gun should be doing. But until you see it, to your point, Paul, it's impossible to even know. I mean, I don't expect people to know what the gun's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, so you have to
until
show
you show
people
them.
what's possible.
Right.
Yeah, and I honestly don't even think it necessarily has to be a match. I do think matches good things, right? But like my first introduction into like this performance shooting was actually JJ Ricazza.
Sure.
Right? And that wasn't really a shooting class. It was more of a movement competition oriented class. But what I saw was really good shooting. And although that wasn't introduced, I saw what people were capable of doing. And I was like, okay, I didn't learn any of that stuff here, but there's some stuff going on here that I got to learn.
Yeah.
Right. So that was just a class. And I never planned on shooting competitions or any of that stuff. But I think, you know, we can still expect, because a lot of cops are not going to go shoot competitions, right? But we can still set them on the right pathway of understanding these principles and fundamentals and training strategies on how to get better, and they will still get a ton of value. Is it still valuable to go shoot a match? Of course. Shoot as many as you can, right? But I think there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit to attack just by training correctly and paying attention to the right stuff.
Well, and matches won't teach you anything. And the only reason I mention matches is because it's generally, for those who are interested, it's accessible, right? It's going to be cheaper than taking a JJ class. It's going to be more frequent, but yeah, it's exposure. You're not learning anything there other than you're seeing what people can do with the gun. You do have to go somewhere to learn how to do it. But
yeah, I mean, listen, they're a test, right? A match. You go out, you perform, you identify specific things, but especially early on, I went to matches. I mean, my first match was in like a leg cast. I had my leg all blown apart, so obviously I couldn't even move. But I was like, hey, this is a good time to like go shoot a match. Didn't do stellar, but I also didn't know how to get any better. I just knew that I sucked. Right. So it still requires you to go seek out the proper sources of information to teach you these types of things that we just talked about, to then go work on, then go back to a match and test it, see if your training stuff is making sense, right? Because you can just, how many guys have been stuck in B class for fucking 5 years? They shoot a match every guy, but they're still a B class shooter. So just going to matches clearly doesn't work. Right.
It's exposure, but it's not learning.
Yeah, it's you're taking a test without studying all the time, and just trying to hook up.
Yep. All right. So we left off. All right. You started changing where you're putting the stock. How do you try to conceptualize the cheek weld, right? Because obviously, that wasn't a huge deal before to you, but now, changing your rifle setup, like now it's an even bigger deal. So why do you think the cheek weld is so important? So like a good example of this, and for me, like when I lift the shoulder up, essentially what I'm trying to do with that shoulder shrug is drive the stock into my cheek. And it's essentially trapping the gun at the back of it's trapping the stock exactly where I want it. So that cheek weld is super important, right? And it's also, for me, it's like, well, that's one of the 4 points of contact. And if my cheek is bouncing around, and that's one thing, like I see this a lot. I started videoing people in classes just to show them like, hey, your cheek is not on the stock at all. But like if you're putting different inputs in one of the 4 places of contact, like you are not going to see a gun that behaves predictably. So what's some stuff that you've kind of figured out with the cheek weld?
So similar things, right? And like I said, so this has a high mount on it, right? So if I want to actually see this dot and have a cheek connection, I would need to be like right there, right? So that gives me my dot right there. This right here, although I have cheek connection, it's not really trapping the gun, right? Mm-hmm. So with certain guns, I can get away with that and tell myself, yes, I have cheek connection. What I found with those nastier guns is I really needed this gun trapped like this, like you're saying. Now, what it gave me was a ton more pressure and connection to that stock that really just felt completely different. So although I thought I had it like this, it wasn't actually doing anything. And although with the guns I was shooting, I was getting away with it, right? Mm-hmm. So I felt like, yeah, man, I have positive contact. Also, with the light connection, it's easier to change. I find when I really trap it and shrug it in, like if I just keep that shrug, that does a really good job with keeping the same consistent pressure in that particular spot. That one variable of change, right? So when you're light on it, you can easily push on it, because you're not really connected to it. But when you're shrugged into that, you are locked. As long as you keep this up, like the connection almost keeps itself, and the pressure keeps itself too.
Do you find that when you were not connected to it, say like that light pressure, like you're describing, the dot would return in different places in the window every time? So instead of like, in other words, maybe an example of this would be like you see the dot in the center of the window, gun goes bang, comes back down. Is it coming down to a different spot each time? Because when I've used the higher, I still have guns with higher mounts just because, you know, we all see students come to classes with higher mounts. Like I want to be able to shoot them. And that's basically the only reason why I have them for the most part. But what I notice is that's almost like a visual cue to me that I don't have the cheek weld. And I just like, when I see that cue happen, it's like, all right, dummy, you need a cheek weld, because if the dot is coming down to a different spot in each, you know, in different places in the window, it's like I don't have a solid connection with my cheek and my head is just kind of floating around. So it's essentially not the dot moving around, it's my head moving around.
Yeah. So I'm going to say, if I'm being honest, I haven't noticed that, but that's because of I was shooting the guns that I was shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So when you're shooting guns like this, that problem doesn't really present itself often. Now that I've changed my mount, I'm not seeing that because I've changed the mount, right? So it makes complete sense what you're saying. I just never experienced it because when I was shooting tall mounts with lower, not correct connection, the guns are tuned correctly, so they didn't exploit that. Right now, if I put this tall boy mount on that 11.75, right, and put that same connection, I'm sure I would see that. I just haven't played that, which is something I could totally do, right? But to answer your question, no, I haven't seen it, because once I've made that new mount correction, I haven't changed that variable. Like that's going to be because I know that I like that.
Gotcha. All right.
I'm not trying to this experience. I'm trying to figure it out very quick, you know? So I'm like, all
right.
Now let's look at the other stuff.
Yeah, for sure. You'll probably see it now that it's in your head.
Yeah.
All right. So that's what you do with your shoulder and cheek weld. So let's move forward from there. What do you do with the firing hand?
So that's changed dramatically, man. Like, I've gotten rid of my hand stops. So when I started playing with the hand placement, I stripped my guns all the way down.
No, the firing hand.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like, the rails all the way down. Like this, I've been shooting this gun. This is why it still has a little spot on it, but you can see how far back it is, right?
Yep.
Originally, they were a lot farther up here. You can see where the light is. Like I had a laser up here.
Yep.
And I was protected way farther on the gun. Now, I was always of the understanding that elbow needed to remain more towards the ground to get that gun to react. Even with brakes, I found that when this elbow flared out, that didn't give me a good result, because brake or not, when this elbow flares out, you have a tendency to kind of steer the gun more. So I noticed that right away. What I found was that since I had my gun set up a certain way, I was just forcing that to work, right? Once I took all the stuff off it, it was kind of like, well, I could put my hand anywhere now. And I did this in my last class. I made guys take off all their furniture on the gun, right? Because everyone's got hand stops, right? And I'm not against hand stops, but they need to be in the right spot, right? So I'm like, hey guys, you're going to hate me for this, but like, take your hand stops off, right? And everybody in that class found that their hand stop, if they still even wanted it, was in the wrong spot. So by taking all that stuff off, I found that even if I keep my elbow down when it's farther out, it still creates a certain amount of tension in that arm. And if I was less disciplined, that tension was more likely to transfer into the front of the gun and steer it around, right? So it wasn't that I couldn't do it. It was that it took more bandwidth to make sure that I wouldn't do it. And I really don't want to start putting bandwidth on that. Like the overall goal for me for shooting is just like bandwidth is like pick small spots, stay on that, and then let everything else be subconscious. Process information, make decisions, right? If it's real life, like that's where I want my bandwidth. I don't want it thinking about, all right, idiot, make sure this elbow doesn't flare out. Really keep it there. Right?
you're looking to mount the gun in a really easy way, or in a way that makes what you want to accomplish with it easy
and comfortable, right?
yes
If things are comfortable, you'll be less likely to change it, right?
Yep.
So what I found is, and this was like a slow progression, I just started bringing my hand further and further back, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm at a spot where it's like, it almost looks stupid. I'm like, I can't believe my hand's that far back. But it's really facilitating a nice reaction from the gun. And I find myself not steering the gun at all. So I'm more, you can kind of see like where now I have my controls. Like my controls were never back there. They were all the way up here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now I just have them right here. It allows that elbow to hang very neutral and relaxed. And this arm is super like relaxed. I don't need it to do anything. So therefore, if it's relaxed, I'm less likely to pressure change that because I just got to keep it relaxed and chill and not influence the gun, right? So I'm finding that like, and this might be a tad, yesterday when I was shooting all those rounds, this might be like 1 or 2 Picatinny too far back, right? So there's a delicacy to it, right, of finding that sweet spot, and I'm still trying to figure that out. But nonetheless, the farther I brought my arm back and the more I just let it hang and kind of just be there as like furniture,
Mm-hmm.
the gun behaved and the less likely I was to change. And that's kind of like what we said in the beginning. Like, it's not that you can't do it, right? Like if you put bandwidth on it, I can make almost anything work. Like even with the three prong and the 11.5, like I could muscle that to get it to work here and there. But was it as consistent? Was it as intuitive and subconscious? No, not at all. And that's what you're looking for, a subconscious, very intuitive, relaxed position that is going to minimize us making mistakes.
Yep. That elbow hanging is something that, both Max and I heard Frank Proctor say probably 10 years ago.
Yep.
And he was like, just let that elbow hang. And it was probably something like, let it do. And we were like, word. And I think he's definitely correct. And he's correct because you could just let that elbow hang, right? That sucks the gun back into your shoulder without you having to put a bunch of physical effort into it, which is important. And then you just let the rifle do its thing. And that what he's saying is like that is going to facilitate the mount, that is a mount that facilitates the gun behaving in a really predictable way. And I think if you're putting a bunch of effort into trying to mount the gun, right? Good example of this, maybe I pull 110% with the support hand. And it's like, well, if you're exerting all of that force and energy, how long can you hold that for? And if you can't hold it forever throughout maybe a 30 round or a 40 round stage, it's like, then you're putting different inputs on the gun, right? If you have, maybe you're pulling 110%, that 110% quickly turns into 50 to 40, maybe back up to 60 to 70, and you're putting different inputs on the gun. Like that would not be ideal. And so that elbow being bent, I fully agree with you. Like as soon as I bend my elbow, I feel the rifle suck back into my shoulder, and it's effortless. It's I think even Frank calls it easy effort, which is a great way of describing it. Yeah,
I constantly tell guys in class, man, I'm like, hey, do less, right? Like let more, which is, in shooting, it really becomes true. Like I want to do as least as possible to get the gun to react in a specific manner and nothing more. And that will usually probably be comfortable doing correctly, and I'll be able to maintain that better for longer, more aggressive shot strings. And then picking a small spot and just staying on that is difficult enough. Like I need the other stuff just to be like easy.
Yeah, I started bringing up this demo in classes with rifles specifically, where like I would just hold it with 2 fingers, right? I hold the rail with my index finger and my thumb, and then basically on the grip, I'll just wrap my thumb around the grip and then run my trigger finger. And all I'm trying to do is just keep consistent pressure back into my shoulder with these 2 fingers. Not saying that this is how we mount the rifle, just, as an example, just to show people like, hey, it doesn't require a ton of effort. However, if you do these 2 things properly, right? Keeping consistent pressure back into your shoulder and looking at the place where you want the bullets to go, I can get the rifle to behave pretty freaking good.
Yeah.
And it doesn't require a ton of effort.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause you're, although it may not be the most efficient way to mount the gun, it doesn't violate the principles. And at the end of the day, if we don't violate the principles, we get the result that we're looking for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So that's where your support hand is. Your support hand is coming further back. Your elbow, is it stuck out to the side? Is it pointing down?
It's down. My elbow was always down though. Even when it was farther out, it was down. But since the arm was out, it required muscular tension to turn it down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the farther I have my arm out, the elbow kind of wants to flare out. So I would purposely drive that elbow down, right? To get that same result. And that would work, right? Until I got lazy and she'd creep out and then I'd start pushing on the gun. So if I kept focus, that was a specific technique that, yes, I could make work at a very high level. It was just, it bared the baggage of becoming subjective to change, kind of with longer shot strings and farther distance, where it's like, okay, that can work in small isolated instances, right? But is there a way to make that same behavior happen for longer durations, right? And be less, require less bandwidth? Because that took me to like consciously tell myself, like, keep that elbow locked in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And listen, eventually, like, it just became part of the mount, and I was able to do it. But nonetheless, like, that tension was still there, and that if there's tension built up, at some point, if I get fast enough where I'm uncomfortable, it will transfer.
Yeah,
So,
I started showing people like the elbow pointed down is basically a cue for you, right? And typically what I see is as soon as people start doing things like going fast, maybe faster than what they're used to, and they start out with that elbow pointing down, and it's like you see this progression happen, right? And it typically comes with tension, where like the stock starts coming off of the shoulder, meaning that pressure change is starting to happen. So instead of pulling straight back into the shoulder and keeping that pressure consistent, the support hand is starting to leave the exercise, so to speak. Then what typically comes next is that elbow, the support hand elbow or support side elbow starting to flare out. And what they're doing is it's like a vicious snowball effect, in my opinion, right? Like they start off maybe target focused, and since the mount starts to come apart, the dot starts behaving differently. And because of that, they start putting different inputs on the gun and trying to steer it around. And that's when that elbow starts to flare out. And that's when they start staring at the dot. And you'll see, like, if you shoot, like in my classes, we always do like 5 rounds. I just call it 5-round group shooting, where we're shooting at kind of that like reactive type of pace. That drill specifically at 30, 40 yards, if that, what I just described happens to you, you will see a seatbelt style group on the target, where if you're a righty, you'll see bullets track high into the right, and then the subsequent ones will go low into the left because you're steering the gun around. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll also add one to that. I think usually when that snowball effect happens, the survival mode is to reconnect the gun by pushing on it with your posture.
Yeah. Yes. Yep.
And they're like, oh, fuck, this is loosening up. I better really shove on that. And then that's catastrophic.
Yep. 1,000%. 1,000%. Yeah. So I agree with that elbow being pointed down. I also find that when I try to flare that elbow out and try to, people will know who I'm talking about. But like I watched a video the other day where like this guy was like, I flare the elbow out and keep positive pressure down on the gun. That to me, it's almost like I completely disagree, and I've proven that to myself to be wrong, at least for the way I mount the gun or for what I see or whatever. And I think it doesn't do what I want it to do, because it would be similar to like putting a gas pedal or whatever on a pistol. And using it for something that the gas pedal is not used for. And that would be like pushing down. Like this is something popular that we see a lot lately, like people putting gas pedals on their pistol and they're like, oh yeah, I get a lot of leverage on it and push down. And it's like, yeah, your gun's flat, but it's returning low left. Like that's not actually what we want at all. So I see the same exact thing when I flare that support side elbow out and like try to keep positive pressure down. It's almost like the gun returns lower instead of just returning to the spot.
Yeah.
So I'm not a fan of it.
Did you ever get taught the technique where you counter rotate the upper and the lower?
Oh yeah.
Oh, for pistol?
No, for
Right.
rifle. So you would rotate this out and this hand in, and you're kind of doing like the same thing with a pistol. You're like splitting the gun apart, and when
Oh
you
my God.
guns opposite direction, that like locks them out. That
Yeah,
was introduced to me. I want to say like I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago. Obviously, did not work well.
Well, again, it's one of those things where you can get it to, yeah, I can get the dot
Yeah.
to hold completely still when I'm standing there, but it's not a durable mount. It will not last through a long string of fire or movement or anything, because tell me you know you're getting the same pressures every time you bring the gun up. Tell me you know you're getting the same pressures when you transition targets. It's not possible.
And
Well-
you can get it initially. You won't make it throughout the shot string because it's 110, and then it's going to slowly degrade.
Dude, even worse than that, like part of being an instructor is knowing what not to tell people so they don't do those specific things, right? So like if you told an entire class, and this is why I hate the pinky pressure thing, right? Like if you told an entire class, hey, pull on your pinky, where's the freaking gun return? Low left. It's like all you're doing is helping the gun return low left by doing that stuff. So like if you told them like, hey, do what you just described, like that whole horseshoe thing where we're like ripping the gun in half, I think all you're going to do is get people to fight with the gun and make it behave even less predictable. So I think, part of being a good instructor is like knowing what not to say. This way people get like the correct idea at all times, and they're not thinking, because like the dude that does that, he might shoot well, but he's conceptualizing it a different way.
Yes.
Right. And then if you come out and say like, hey, rip the gun in half, like, man, I hate shit like that.
Yeah. And I think it's also important, man, like what not to say, and then also when to say it and how much to say.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Like if you go, I mean, I know you do it, and I like to do it too. I like to just give you like one thing to think about. This is what I want you to mentally think about right now. And I get it. Like you'll have guys that are repeat customers, or guys that have been to other classes, and they're like, this fucking dude didn't even mention this yet. It's like, relax, bro. We're getting there. Right now, I just want you to connect to this. And then I'll give you another thing to think about. And then I'm going to give you another thing to think about. And I think the layer is really important for people that are unfamiliar with these principles and concepts and what we're looking to create, because you can saturate them. And although even if it's like all correct information, they will just remember the last thing you said.
Yeah, for sure. Or, I think something really, really common, like they get better at that one thing, and then you move on to something else, and then that one thing just goes out the fucking window all over again, which is normal because they haven't onboarded that information yet.
Yeah, but at least when they go back and if they're taking notes, they have the progression of how it builds, right? So yes, you don't have the bandwidth to subconsciously do the multitasking that's required right now. But if you have the system on how to slowly build that stuff, eventually you'll start making every little piece subconscious and it'll come together. And if you format it and layer it correctly, it makes it repeatable and retrainable for themselves without you there. I think.
All right. So I think before you were kind of more square, like your upper body, like square to the target, right? Are you still square to the target, or have you started? I hesitate to say bladed, right? Because when you say bladed, people think like completely bladed, like you're shooting a bow and arrow. Like, are you slightly bladed in terms of your posture?
So my stance is kind of dictated on what the environment is and what I'm going to be doing, right? Like, I feel like I can get this gun. Like, if you're just like, hey, man, stand here 25 yards, bill drill, right? Burn it down. I wouldn't say I'm bladed, but the strong leg is definitely farther back, but I like bringing it wider than lateral. So it's more of like, if you had your legs like this, I can't see it in the camera.
That's okay. Like greater than shoulder width.
Yeah, so it would be like this, but it's kind of like dog legged out. And then I have upright posture, and I'm loading kind of the front quad.
Okay.
And my knees are bent, athletic stance, but it's not like as bladed as I would say like when Matt shoots.
So, like, but like But like your shoulders, are your shoulders still like square to the target, or are you kind of bladed off?
No, shoulders are still square.
Still square. Okay.
Yep. Today, to today's date, they are still square.
Yep.
We'll see.
I used to shoot like that too. And then I've tried like the complete opposite, like being really, really bladed. Like if you watch Ben shoot a rifle, like really, really bladed, he gets the gun to behave the way he wants to, obviously, like the dude shreds with the rifle. But for me, it's kind of like somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
Like I find that when I blade, one of the biggest problems with it, or like when I blade a lot, right? One of the biggest problems is I can't, like there's no flat place to put the buttstock. And so like, so like I need to be a little bit more square to have the buttstock to be completely on my shoulder. And so like I just call it like a neutral position.
So like when I look at you shoot, I think you are square. You just allow your shoulder to hang back a little bit. Where most of us bring our forward, you don't bring the shoulder forward, you just bring it up. So your chest is still square, but the gun has a little bit of a blade to it because you never brought this up. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Bring it up instead of forward and up. Where most of us, but like myself personal, I bring it up and forward, you know? And I think that's why it kind of gives that resemblance, like when I look at it. But if I look at your chest is still square.
Yep.
With that fair assessment?
I think that, yep, for sure. I find that when I roll this shoulder all the way forward, that's not something that I can, well, two things. It's not something that I can hold for a really long time. So it ends up not being as durable for me. And two, it creates kind of like a hinge point. So it's almost like it doesn't give the rifle a place to go. Whereas if I blade just a little bit, and I need to figure out a different word for this, because when you say blade, people think like, again, shooting a bow and arrow. Like, no, not that. When I blade off or make the shoulder in a little bit more neutral position, so not rolled forward, not all the way back, but some kind of, somewhere in between, it almost gives the rifle a place to go that's consistent without it being like a hard stop. Whereas like if you roll the shoulder forward, what I find is the rifle just comes to a complete stop. And I think that's what creates that like hinge point at the back of the stock. I don't know. That's like from my own testing.
Yeah, I'll look at that. And this is where I think, dude, we're all built different, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And we have different strengths and weaknesses, and we have to find what works for us best to facilitate this core principles. Like if that's what works for you, and that's why I don't tell guys. Like guys get pissy when I teach pistol. Like I don't actually show them how to grip my grip until like way later on. Right? Because I don't want them just doing what I'm doing. Because my hands are my size. The gun that I'm shooting is the gun that I'm shooting. I want them to pay attention to the core principles, and I want them to think about things. And I want you to figure out what works best for you. Eventually, I show them how I go about doing that. But usually when you do that in a class, everyone's just like, well, I'll just do that.
Yeah, that's what they hear. Yeah.
For me, I don't want you paying attention to the Paul Costa fucking Twizzler grip fucking technique. Like I want you to figure out
you should call it that. Twizzler, because I'm twisting at the back of the gun.
Yeah. Yes. So, I think it takes away, and that's the same thing with the mount, right? Here's the principles, here's what we're looking for, and based on your body type, your application, the gun you're shooting, what can and can't you get away with and make it work. Now, keep in mind that we know, as if we're trying to be, experts in this craft, that needs to work for all pistols and all rifles, right? If that's going to be a valid technique and application and employment of that gun, right? So
now, are there some, I don't want to give an example because this would give it away, but at least give away what I'm thinking. Are there some like non-negotiables, so to speak, in terms of technique with rifle mount?
So I'm sure there are, right? But me specifically, like usually when I see specific things, I won't say like, hey, like outside of like the stock not being fully placed,
that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Negotiable, right? Because that's just silly. But outside of that, I usually just kind of give people questions to think about. Like, hey man, like what do you see? What do you feel? how do you feel about this? And I kind of want them to learn through that process of answering their own questions, not just saying, hey, don't do that, you know? And I feel like they increase their aptitude and understanding of what you're trying to do better by just asking them questions. That's just saying, hey, that's wrong, you know?
I agree. Yep. I ask people all the time in classes, like, hey man, what did you see there?
Yeah.
Like, how was the gun returning? And like, I think what happens is people start, on the line, they start hearing me ask questions and they're like, shit, here he comes. He's coming to me now. He's going to ask me what I saw and felt. Right. And they start to have to like pay close attention to this stuff. And, it has to be an honest answer. I have a pretty detailed eye and I'm, able to see quite a bit. So I agree with you. So for me, like the non-negotiable is the stock. It has to be on your body. If it's above your shoulder and you're like, hey, I can get away with it because it's a rifle, that to me, it's like, that is morally wrong, right? Like you wouldn't teak up a pistol because it's only quote unquote 9mm and you can get away with it, right?
Yep.
Like that type of stuff should be completely banished from our existence, in my opinion.
And honestly, it's mainly too because there's no reason to do it.
Right.
Like your body's type, all these different things. Like there's no realistic reason why that would actually say that gun could behave better from having less control. Right. So yes, that's a non-negotiable. I can't think of anything else that is a hard stop, but I think if you train in the right manner, you facilitate information in the right manner, your exploration drills are correct, you end up leading people to the conclusion you want them to without like, hey, fuck stick, you look like an idiot, do this.
Yeah. Although I think that could be required sometimes. Like
need that, right? Because they're like you're feeding them and they're just like, I'm just gonna keep doing what I'm doing. And the result like still shitty. It's like, well, hey dude, like maybe just entertain me. You paid me X amount of dollars to be here. You could try something I talked about.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I
we get a lot of that.
I tend to like if I'm messing something up, like please be direct.
Yeah.
Right. Like like we talked about this on the last podcast. Ben's like, hey, stop shooting like a pussy. I'm like, okay, like I know what that means. I know what he means by that. I was very direct and I know what to do now. Right. That's just kind of the way my like caveman brain works. Like if you tell me that, yep, roger that, I got it.
Yeah, that type of corrective, instruction doesn't bother me either. And I think there's a lot of people it doesn't bother, but I feel like it lacks a little substance because they're so underdeveloped of like what they should even be paying attention to.
You got to know your audience for it. Yeah.
Or like if you're just like, hey, stop being a pussy, that might be visual aggression, go faster in your transitions, trigger break, exit. Where like a newer shooter, they're just like, I don't even know how to stop being a pussy.
Exactly.
Like I need a little bit more.
Yes.
So I think you got to know your audience and know the individual skill level. And there's plenty of people that like, I will say those types of things too, because it adds levity to the class. It makes it better, right? Because they're ready for that level of correction and they understand shooting enough where like, that's all I say. And then there's plenty of people who are like, I need to be very specific with what I'm asking them to do and present it a certain way because they're already so saturated that just giving like that correction is meaningless. If that makes sense.
I agree.
Well,
1,000%.
You can break it down. I mean, there are some things like stock placement, same thing with pistol. There are some things where like, I can tell you the principles, but if you're not doing this one thing, it's a waste of everybody's time. So there are some things where it's like, you have to do this one thing.
Yeah.
It may be a little bit different depending on how you're built and your gun and whatever, but there are some things where it's like, you have to do this one thing. And then past that, it's okay, now we can start digging into what are you seeing? What is the gun doing? But if you're shooting a rifle with the stock off your shoulder and I'm asking you what you're seeing, it's not really going to be relevant because
stock placement and maybe for the most part I would still say cheek connection, but a lot of that's going to be facilitated to the mount, right? Like if you have those high boy mounts, you can't get that proper cheek connection, right? So now I got this guy in class with this boy, right? Like myself included for a long time. If I have them build that proper connection, they won't be able to see their dot.
What do you think about high mounts with cheek risers on the stock? This way you can get a cheek connection.
So I bought a few of them, right, just to play with it.
Mhm.
I didn't like it. I felt like it was kind of counterintuitive, and I felt like you're just building stuff on your gun to, I mean, you're kind of just going in like this circle of like, none of it's actually helping you, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't really understand it. Like, I shouldn't say I don't understand why they did it, right? I have not seen from my training experience that actually helped.
Yep.
That proper cheek connection. It's, as we kind of talked about, yes, I want the cheek on the gun, but if I'm going to build that cheek connection, I also want the entrapment of my shoulder with it. And you could put the riser on it. The shoulder's not going to interface the same way on the side of that stock with a riser as it will with just a butt stock without it. Because like you're really trying to encapsulate that whole thing and trap it. If your face is above it and even trap the bottom of it, there's still kind of like a hinge point and wiggle room where it can still maneuver. Where like if I have it fully encapsulated, like there's no movement. Does that make sense?
For sure.
I don't
Yeah.
think that's a problem.
For me, it's oxymoronic, and I said this on a YouTube video one time. And man, we're gonna do a podcast, and we're gonna answer all of the questions on these YouTube videos, and it should be pretty entertaining. But there were probably 20 comments on there. It's like, no, it's actually not oxymoronic. Like you get a deeper stock placement and cheek. Like, yep, I get it. You can mount the gun, deeper, especially if you're one to mount it center line, right? Yes, you can mount it deeper and get a cheek weld because you have all of that stuff on there. And yes, that is setting the gun up around the way that, you like to mount it. I don't have a problem with it. If you have that level of understanding, like, yep, I have a high mount and I have that on there because I mount it center line and deep and I can still get like, that's not the guy I'm talking to, right? The guy I'm talking to is basically, mounting that stuff on there because he saw it on there, right? And it's like, why is all this shit on here? And they're like, I don't know, right?
Well, especially the cheek risers you see now that are at the back of the stock.
Yeah,
which
it doesn't
just tells
do
me
anything.
You're standing up straight and shooting all weird. Like what?
and
What are you
that's
doing?
they're on the back of the stock. And dude, that's why I don't get too much into like I keep an open mind where like, hey, dude, like maybe this guy's figured out something that I haven't, right? So like
Sure.
if able to do
Try it.
what I want him to do at the speeds that I want him to do it, even if it's silly to me, dude, if it works for you, it works for you, right? Like I'm not trying to change the world. I'm just trying to change how they view shooting and what they pay attention to. And I think once they understand that, everyone ends up kind of coming to the same conclusion if you really understand it and you're paying attention, right? So I fight less of those wars, although I have my personal opinions on them, right? Like I do think they're counterproductive. Like you said, oxymoron, great word for that. But if a dude's able to do what I'm asking him to do,
Yeah.
do you?
Yep, I'm with it. This is also why I have so many different rifle setups. It's not because I want all these guns.
Yep.
Although, hey man, I'm a gun dude. Yes, there's a lot, right? But like they're all set up a little bit differently because, hey man, I want to be able to speak educated on this stuff just because people show up with it. So like if you went in my gun room, you would see Unity mounts, you would see two different height of Wilcox mount, absolute co-witness, 1/3, 193, 187s from Parker Mount Machine, like all of that stuff is on there. And this is also, I mean, for me, I want to be able to speak not only intelligently, but like also save people money. So like, hey, in other words, like, hey, this is the thing that most people should get, right?
Yep. No, I think it's important, man, because and for a long time, I would say I found what worked for me in a lot of things, and I just live with that, right? And then people would ask you questions about it, and I'm not going to lie to people. It's like, yeah, man, I've never explored with that, right? And I guess if you're going to be in this industry, right, and you're going to be a resource for people, it's better to be a deeper resource so you can speak pros and cons, and that requires you to actually like set up guns different ways, even if you don't like it, and just play with it and force yourself like, well, can I make this work, right?
Yep.
Because maybe this guy has figured out it may not work with the way I'm doing it currently, but can I figure it out? If I change some things, can I make that work? And I think that just leads to a better, well-rounded, more informed instructor to help you guide students on their choices of equipment and setups, and basically it's all surround the principles anyway.
Yep.
But I've been getting more into that. I would say in the last like 2 years, I've been kind of really doing it. But for a long time, I was just like, hey man, this works for me, and I'm just going to double down on this because my goal was just to become the best shooter I could, right? And the more you play with that kind of stuff, it detracts from you building skill because you're rediscovering all types of stuff. Now I'm at the point where like I have the bandwidth and capability where I can start playing with all that other stuff and looking a little bit deeper, and I have the time and understanding to where like I can evaluate it critically better.
Yeah, and it's like that evaluation is there because you're trying to better your craft as an instructor, right? This is like I would not recommend people going out and setting up 10 different, type of setups just to explore it. It's like, man, that's probably not as counterproductive in terms of skill, right?
Yeah, you're going to get nowhere with that real quick, right?
Yeah.
Especially having figured out some of this stuff already. Like, I think it requires you to have a baseline of competency, a fairly high level baseline of competency, and then you can start messing with some variables here and there and tweaking stuff and really fine tune it and figuring out what works, what doesn't work. And then since you have that core baseline of understanding, you know exactly why it didn't work, not just my hands aren't here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, it worked because they weren't A zones. It's like, well, no, that doesn't work because it didn't facilitate me getting the proper cheek weld. I wasn't able to keep same pressure. That stimulated whatever. I had the absolute forces me to drive my head down a little bit more, which made me shove on the gun, like whatever it is, which by the way, in that absolute, which I like it all.
So you dig the absolute height now?
I think it's got to be a 1/3.
Yep, that's where I've landed too. Lower 1/3. Yep.
And the only reason why it's got to be a 1/3 is because my first round times are just slightly slower because I have to get my head a little bit lower, and that's kind of counterintuitive for me from the way I've been shooting. But once I get it, wow, you're looking good. So but then I put the 1/3 on there, and the 1/3 was because I still had the same connection, still had the same pressures, and it was just a little bit faster to get my dot, and it felt a little bit more comfortable, where I wasn't so barreled into the gun.
Yes.
But if I set up on this, dude, I can rail, and it's just crushing rat holes.
Yeah.
So I like it does work from that standpoint, but just like introducing the weapon quickly, I was probably 2/10 slower.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm 6'3", 180 with a giraffe neck.
Yeah.
Even with a lower 1/3, I'm wrapped around the gun, and it is trapped. But yeah, there is the element of like, especially from like a high ready with the stock under my elbow, getting wrapped around it. It takes a second.
Yeah, but once you get it, you're like, okay, cool, I can maintain this.
I think too, what a lot of people miss sometimes, with the higher mounts is when you start doing positional shit with a rifle. So not just the 50 yards and in stuff, maybe out to 200, which that's not long range shooting, right? That's rifle shooting in my opinion. Yep. And so getting into, odd positions on barricades or, whatever the case may be, if you don't have a cheek weld, it becomes very problematic really quickly. And one thing that I've found is with the higher mounts on, say, just a VTAC barricade, right? On one of the steps on the side or whatever, you send a round, the gun doesn't return back down to where it lifted from. Therefore, it makes it really hard to call misses. So like what you'd be looking for, right? If you're shooting 200 yards, if you missed, you want to be able to see that miss so you can then make that correction. And if the gun if you fire it and it lifts and just stays someplace because your mount doesn't facilitate it coming back down, that could be really problematic. And so what I have found is that cheek weld is even more important when you're shooting, prone, barricades, things like that. Like you have to be able to trap the stock. This way the gun behaves in a really predictable way, and you could do things like call misses and make corrections really quickly.
Dude, absolute and prone for me and my body type.
It's the way.
Dude, I was like, this is it. Now, it's slightly weaker in other areas, but like prone, absolute, I was like, this gun doesn't fucking move, man. I can rail on it.
And prone is a rifle shooting position. That was another comment on that YouTube video because Nick mentioned something about how gas mask shooting was like a 1% activity, and somebody was like, "Well, so is prone." I completely disagree. I think prone is a rifle shooting position. I mean, it's not going to be as frequent as standing up and running around, but like that is a rifle shooting position. That is not a 1% thing. It needs to be. You need to have a setup that works in prone.
I actually thought 1% with a gas mask was pretty generous.
It is generous.
Yeah, it is. And also, man, like if you're a guy running a gas mask on a team, you probably should have vis lasers on your gun.
Right.
So like, it's like, yeah, dude, like you don't need to get in that optic. Like, use your vis laser, right? Like there's things that you can do to make that work.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, it definitely is. But like you said, it's a very low percentage, and then even at that percentage, we have other tools on our guns, or hopefully your team has those tools where like you can make that not an issue. Just like passive shooting under NVGs, like that's not a thing.
I know that gets brought up a lot, and it's like, oh, I shoot passively, and it's like, I get it. Like, yep, be able to do it. However, what percentage of your shooting is just that? Especially like, dude, you got an end gal on the end of your rifle, and you're gonna shoot passively.
Well, I can shoot passively with a lower 1/3. I can shoot passively with my big ass PVS 13s and my giraffe neck out of a 1/3 EOTech.
Yeah. Yep.
It sucks, but I can do it.
Yeah. Rick does a really good job from Achilles. Dude, he's put the reps in, really good at it. But for me, I don't put a lot of work in it. Can I do it? Sure, I can do it. But with the equipment these days, I don't view like it's a superior aiming method when you're using that type of equipment, and I'd rather just use my laser. And I teach night vision a decent amount, right? Like we explore with passive shooting, right? Like to introduce you to it, but it's more exploratory. Like, hey man, like how would you do this if you had to do it? But the majority of the time is laser. Like that's where I want you really spending the effort.
Well, to me, it's like you could shoot way more aggressively with the laser than you can passive. And like you say, can you do it? Yeah, but you've got to put the time in to do it. Every time I've tried passive shooting, I find it's like if you try to shoot predictively like that, it makes it very, very difficult because you are just looking at the dot, and it makes it really hard to see past all of that stuff.
A tube through a tube, depending on the quality of your night vision and the looms in the area, like the ambient light and stuff. Like you could have a very dark target behind that, and now you've got this firefly in front of you, and you're going through all these pieces of glass. It's very hard to not look at it. Like if you're shooting one quick round, that's where guys are like, when you do like the ready up drills, they're like, yeah, got this. It's like do a bill drill, do a bill drill that way, and depending on the ambient light, like it can really be difficult to see what that target is, right? And then if you're telling me you're going to use your illuminator on your gun to add lumens into that area so you can see better passively, it's like, well, then why wouldn't you just use your laser?
Right.
Like, well, I'll just throw my illuminator on. It's like, cool, just use your laser then.
Yes. Yeah, I'm with you. All right, one last thing.
Sure.
Because people are going to ask. So, and they're going to ask because I posted something about shooting with two different optics. So having a LPVO and then a dot on the side of the LPVO. What are the pros? And have you messed with that any?
So very little bit. And what I found was, and this is old, but so this is before kind of like my new mounting epiphany, but I did it rolling that stock sideways.
Oh, I hate that one. Yeah, that's the that's a LaRue. No, it's top. So it's top mounted, but it's at a 45, right?
No, it's top mounted at.
I see. Okay, yeah, I hate that one too.
So I don't do a lot with this, right? Like I don't shoot limited power variable optics, right? It's not my thing. Anything that I could find myself in for real world, 3 times magnifier is going to do it.
Me as well.
That doesn't exist in my world. Like, I think the longest shot in New Jersey history was like 80 yards with a precision rifle, right?
Yep.
Just due to our environment and things like that. Like anything's possible, right? But anything that I would realistically be able to PID, because obviously you have to PID, a 3 times magnifier is going to get it done for me. So I don't spend a lot of time with these setups, so I can't speak educatedly, but the little bit that I did not, I saw you doing it and it looked really good. I really didn't like rotating the gun like that and getting into it. And probably it's just lack of experience, right? But that's why I ended up putting it on 12 o'clock, because it allowed me to keep my same kind of mount, so I could just go in and then come up, get the dot. It was a little bit more intuitive and streamlined, but it's not something I mess with. So what have you found?
So for me, when I tried the top dot, I really hated it just because the connection is changing all the time. Does it change when you have a 45-degree dot? Yes. However, I am keeping the cheek weld with a 45-degree dot, whereas if I have a top dot, I no longer have that cheek weld. I go from cheek weld to basically a chin weld, or what I see people do a lot of time is the head's off the stock. So pros and cons of running an LPVO and a 45-degree offset dot. Some of the pros, like very capable setup, right? In other words, I have an optic with a reticle in it, meaning I can use that reticle to shoot outside of 300 yards. Outside of 300 on that 12.5-inch gun that I've got it set up on, that's typically when I start to need some sort of reticle to be able to hit that target, right? Meaning at 400 yards with that 12.5-inch gun, I'm 2.5 mils low. 2.5 mils is right at the bottom of the circle in that reticle, in that K69 optic. 550, I believe, was it was either 3.5 or 4 mils. So like the reticle makes it really easy to hit at distance. So it's a force multiplier in terms of what you're able to do at further distances. Where the dot comes in handy, obviously it's a red dot, way easier to shoot up close, like that fast, nasty shooting. Red dots are going to be king. The LPVO, even at 1x, not easy to do. It is not the same as a red dot, and it's simply because it has parallax. So for instance, if you're doing something like transitions, wide transitions, just as an example, you have your dot on the target, you press the trigger, you look to another target, and you don't see that dot until it is directly in front of your face. Like you see blackness and then boom, there it is. And to me, it's like my eyes want to bounce back and forth between the target and the dot. The other thing that I typically don't like about it is if you have your LPVO zoomed in, like you typically would in maybe a PCSL match or a 3-gun match, right? Zooming in on 3x because, hey, I'm going to shoot a plate rack at 50, 60 yards, whatever the case may be. Maybe it's 100, right? You are not target focused anymore because you're looking through the tube. If you're looking through the tube, you are reticle focused, right? And maybe there's some up close, targets that you need to roll the gun and now all of a sudden be target focused. So it's shifting focuses back and forth. Definitely not something I'm a fan of. I also think, changing the mount back and forth. Does it change it? Like, yeah, it does. It's not a ton. However, the index is what was difficult for me. So like, yeah, I can keep consistent pressures, or maybe I come off of the pressure to turn it and then pull back in. That's not really ideal, but like the index of doing that was difficult. So like, it's going to require a whole lot more dry fire on my part in order to like really hammer that stuff in. I'm going to shoot PCSL next year, and I'm not sure if I want to take that setup or like an EOTech and a magnifier. It'll most likely be at EOTech and a magnifier.
I have a bunch of guys show up in classes with them. None of them do well. Now, they're not you, right? And they clearly lack an understanding of just the core principles and things like that. But usually when I see guys coming in with the 45 degrees, they struggle to be able to keep that consistent mount. And man, like, if you understand how to do it, do it. I haven't played. And the reason why I probably won't play with it enough is because I'm not interested in really long range. I'm like 200 yards in guy kind of thing. Like, and I want to spend all my time exploring and developing and just making that faster and more nasty. And there are also no real world application for me and what I do where that would ever present itself. So like I don't do sniper stuff. I don't do any of that kind of stuff. So I'm a dog guy primarily. So it's like a pistol primarily is like what we're using. And then, you know, carbines. Is it cool? Is it interesting? Yeah, maybe I'll play with it a little bit. Like I have the stuff. But I probably won't deep dive in it because there's so much stuff to still work on, you know, with all the other stuff that we're doing.
Yeah. I'm a nerd. I used to shoot like PRS matches, shoot out to 1,600 yards at times. Like, when I get on stuff, I'm like, yep, 1,000% all in. So I don't know. I bounce back and forth between stuff.
I like the offset on the gun that I have the gun that I have the 4-16 on. The offset makes a lot of sense, but I don't know, man. I have never found myself in a situation where having the offset with a 1X makes any sense for me.
Shooting an LPVO, weren't you, for a hot minute?
I mean, I still have LPVOs on all kinds of random guns. I have a 1-10 that I put on that new ADM, and I had an offset on that, and I zeroed the offset, and I shot, I don't know, 1,500 rounds, and I never used the offset, never turned the gun to this. And then I pulled the LPVO off because I was shooting aggressive stuff like you, Paul. I was just like, this is dumb. Why am I spending my time, training time, which I only get so much. I don't have a backyard range. Yep. Why am I spending my training time beating myself up on this LPVO when I'm not going to shoot LPVO stuff? And I can see a day when, you know, when if I like get into, you know, rifle matches, 2-gun matches where there are far distant targets where it might make sense for me to start working on it. But for my kind of shooting now, I got into LPVO stuff because, you know, technology improved. I thought it was a cool thing to have in my toolbox, and then I just never used it. So, you know,
I see most people get into them. Like when you ask them, it's like they're looking for a do-it-all gun.
Right.
And all I see with that is it does all of it not well.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
For sure. I agree.
That's exactly right. If I know I'm going to be shooting something with, and yet, you know, again, we're talking boogaloo, end of the world, you know, that's hard to even talk about. But if I'm getting myself into a situation where if I'm shooting a match or something where I need some distance, I'm going to pull out the gun with the 4-16 in it that does distance really well.
Yeah.
If I'm shooting something close, I'm going to get the gun with the red dot. And again, I know that there are guys who compete. I mean, plenty of 2-gun, 3-gun guys who, it makes a lot of sense to have that set up. That's just not me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. You bring up a good point. We'll dive into that world of zombie apocalypse type stuff real quick. I think people's understanding of what that actually would be is lacking, right?
Oh yeah.
If you think you're going to find yourself as this lone wolf running around and you're going to take it at 600 yards, I would say even if you're capable of doing it, that's stupid, right? So now they're unaware of your presence. Now I'm going to gauge them, hopefully neutralize some people. And now I've put them aware of my presence where they could be now moving and working towards my position where I could have my family and things like that. It's like, yeah, dude, you're not looking to take any fight that you don't absolutely have to. So if you were doing that stuff, then it would be in a team setting. If you're in a team setting, you would have what you said, Max. You would have a guy denoted to be shooting long range stuff, you know? So to me, it's a competition gun, right?
Yeah,
for doing that type of stuff, real world application stuff. And most of my guys that I see using it are not competition competitors. They are zombie apocalypse, one gun does it all guys.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I set mine up the way I did.
Yeah.
That's why that particular gun has that optic, you know, set up on it. Like that particular gun has a freaking Q cherry bomb on it too. Like that is not something I'm going to run around and teach with, right? However, like for a match gun, that thing should be pretty freaking legit. A 12.5-inch gun with a 1-6 and a offset dot. I think for PCSL, it should be the ticket. If not, if I don't, you know, keep that set up, I'll probably just throw
an
magnifier on it.
PCSL get? Is it match dependent?
I think it's match dependent. I haven't shot one yet, but like talking to some homeboys that went and shot, you know, PCSL nationals, I think there were some targets out to 2 something.
Yeah.
When I heard that, I'm like, that's like EOTech and magnifier type of category. However, it is really freaking quick just to turn the gun and hose with a dot. So I don't know. We'll play with it and
Sam Callahan over at Double Eagle. He runs PCSL matches, and I haven't shot one of his PCSLs, but I shoot a bunch of his USPSA, and I think he has one stage that's maybe like 200 yards. And to me, like, I'm definitely want to jump into one of them just for fun. But I'm going to do it with a magnifier, you know. And listen, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. I'm still gonna do it with a magnifier because like that makes most sense to me. And then it's gonna work. If it's 200, 250, like I don't see why that wouldn't work. You know, even if it's 5-inch pie plates, I don't see why that would be fine.
Yeah, to me, it's like that's where that Uber Gucci Wilcox mount and magnifier comes in handy. Like that thing really holds zero pretty well. So like I can pop that thing off, you know, from the dovetail. And when I need it, I could just pop the magnifier back on. It'll still hold zero and all that jazz. So I don't know. That's probably what I'm going to end up running.
I mean, I would like to see you run it with the LPVO and just see what you thought, you know?
Yeah, but here's the thing, dude. If I don't think I'm going to win because I have a piece of gear that I don't like, I'm like, that shit's coming off. Like, I'm that competitive. If I feel like going into it, if I'm like, man, I'm not real confident with this thing, I ain't doing it.
Because we don't have local PCSL matches. It's a bit of an investment to get to one.
Yep.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess Sam's like 2.5 hours for me, so that's not too bad.
Yeah.
You know, you can do that. Run up, shoot the match, and run back.
Yeah.
I still go, but.
Dude, this was good. Tell people where they can find you.
You can find me predominantly the best way to find would be on Instagram. Would be Costa, COSTA _actual. You can send me DMs there. There you'll have like my link tree into the website and all that stuff like that. So if you go to IG, you'll see all the other spots to send me emails or whatever you guys want.
Yeah.
Course,
you guys
courses.
Yep. You guys listening should go take a class from Paul. I hosted him last year. I took the class and I was able to see quite a bit, and I dig it. So you should also take a class from him because he's actually going out here trying new shit and trying to make himself better, which is not something that is normal with instructors.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. So I appreciate you coming on, dude. This was a really good talk. Hopefully some people get some stuff out of this. And yeah, man. See you guys on the next one.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yep.
Bye.
Later.